The dense alien jungle stretched endlessly in all directions. Thick vines hung from towering trees, their broad leaves blocking the light from the twin suns above. Strange calls echoed from the unseen creatures hiding in the undergrowth. Ethan Carter, a seasoned human scout, moved carefully through the tangled vegetation, his pulse steady but his senses sharp. This was an unexplored world, newly discovered by humanity. His mission was simple: survey the land, note any potential threats, and report back. His rifle, a standard-issue pulse weapon, was gripped firmly in his hands. He had learned long ago that new planets often held dangers no one expected. A rustling sound made him freeze. Something was following him. Ethan's eyes darted around, scanning the dense foliage. He had seen strange creatures on this planet, some harmless, some not. But the way this one moved, slow and deliberate, made him uneasy. Another sound. Closer this time. His instincts screamed danger. Without hesitation, Ethan turned, raising his rifle, his heart pounding. A massive shape lunged from the shadows, its glowing eyes locking onto him. A beast. Huge. Fast. He fired. The pulse shot hit the creature square in the chest. It let out a sharp, pained cry and collapsed into the ferns. Ethan took slow, cautious steps forward, keeping his rifle trained on the motionless figure. He had seen too many things pretend to be dead before attacking again. The jungle was silent now. Not even the distant creatures made a sound. Then he heard it. A whisper, soft, weak. "Why did you hurt me?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The voice was not deep or monstrous. It was soft, almost human. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. He stepped closer, his rifle still raised. The figure on the ground was not a beast. It was a woman. She lay in the ferns, one hand clutching her wound. Her body was covered in smooth, dark fur, but her features were delicate, expressive. Her large golden eyes, filled with pain, looked directly at him. She wasn't a mindless creature. She was intelligent. Ethan's grip on his rifle loosened. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had shot first without knowing what he was attacking. "I thought." He hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I thought you were an animal." The woman's ears twitched slightly, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, despite her pain, she let out a soft breath, a small, bitter laugh. "I thought the same about you," she murmured. Ethan quickly knelt beside her, his training taking over. He pulled out a medical kit from his belt and inspected her wound. The energy shot had burned through her side, but it wasn't fatal. "I can help," he said, carefully pressing a healing patch against the wound. The alien woman flinched but didn't resist. She watched him with cautious curiosity. "Why?" Ethan met her gaze. He didn't have an easy answer. "Because I was wrong." Her eyes studied him for a moment before she gave a slow nod. The jungle rustled again. This time, Ethan knew it wasn't just the wind. The woman stiffened. "They're coming." "Who?" Ethan asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. "The ones who saw your ship land," she whispered. "If they find you, they won't ask questions. They will kill you." A cold feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. This planet wasn't empty. And now, someone, or something, was hunting him. Ethan pressed his back against the cold stone wall, gripping his rifle tightly. The growls outside the cave echoed through the narrow entrance, sending chills down his spine. The Dravolk were waiting. Celerin sat beside him, one hand resting on her injured side. Though she was clearly in pain, her golden eyes remained sharp, scanning their surroundings. "We cannot stay here forever," she said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan exhaled slowly. She was right. If they waited too long, the creatures outside would either find a way in or call for more of their kind. "We need a way out," Ethan muttered. He checked his ammo. Only a few shots left. Not enough to fight through the Dravolk. Celerin ran her fingers along the cave wall, feeling for something unseen. "There may be another way." Ethan turned to her. You know this place. She nodded slightly. Not this cave exactly, but the land. My people once lived here before the Dravel came. Some caves connect to others. There could be a passage. Ethan's hope flickered. Then let's find it. Together, they moved deeper into the cave. The air grew colder, and the walls narrowed. It was dark, but Sailrin led the way with confidence, her fingers brushing against the rock. Ethan followed close behind, listening carefully. The Dravolk still growled outside, but they did not enter. Either they were too large, or they were waiting for an easier kill. Minutes passed in silence. Then, here, Sailrin stopped, placing her hand on a section of the wall. There was a small crack in the stone, barely visible in the dim light. Ethan stepped closer and touched it. The rock was loose. "Help me," she said. Together, they pushed. At first, nothing happened. But then, with a low rumble, the stone shifted. A narrow tunnel revealed itself behind it. Ethan peered inside. It was dark, but it seemed large enough to crawl through. More importantly, there was fresh air coming from the other side. A way out, he breathed. Sailrin gave a small nod, but her body wavered slightly. She was exhausted. "You go first," Ethan said. "I'll follow." She hesitated but then crawled into the tunnel. Ethan waited until she was halfway through before squeezing in after her, dragging his rifle along. The space was tight. The rough stone scraped against his arms, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears. But they were moving. Then behind them, a sudden roar. Ethan's breath caught. The Dravolk had realized they were escaping. Hearing the sound, Sailrin moved faster, pulling herself forward despite her injury. Ethan followed, gritting his teeth as the tunnel sloped downward. Then, without warning, the ground disappeared. Ethan fell forward, tumbling through empty space before landing with a hard thud. Dust filled the air, making him cough. Sailrin landed beside him, wincing. They had fallen into a lower chamber. But they were out. Above them, the tunnel was too small for the Dravolk to follow. For now, they were safe. Ethan helped Sailrin to her feet. "You okay?" She nodded weakly. "We need to keep moving." Ethan looked around. The new chamber opened into a vast underground cavern, with a faint glow in the distance. "Then let's go," he said. Together, they stepped into the unknown, leaving the Dravolk behind, for now. Ethan helped Sailrin stand as they both caught their breath. They had escaped the Dravolk, but now they were deep underground. The air was cool, and the cavern stretched far beyond what their eyes could see. A faint blue glow shimmered in the distance. "What is that?" Ethan asked, adjusting his grip on his rifle. Sailrin squinted. "Bioluminescent moss," she said. "It thrives in underground rivers. If there is moss, there is water." Ethan exhaled in relief. Water meant survival. Carefully, they moved toward the glow, stepping over jagged rocks and uneven ground. The sound of dripping water echoed through the cavern. Sailrin winced with every step. "You need to rest," Ethan said, glancing at her injury. "I can manage," she replied. But Ethan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. After a few more steps, they reached a shallow stream. Clear, cold water flowed gently over smooth stones. Sailrin knelt beside it, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. Ethan did the same, sighing as the cool liquid refreshed him. It was the first moment of peace they had since the attack. But it wouldn't last. Suddenly, Sailrin's body tensed. Her ears twitched, and she turned her head slightly. Ethan froze. "What is it?" She raised a hand for silence. Then he heard it. A low, distant hum. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. Something was in the cavern with them. Sailrin whispered, "We are not alone." Ethan scanned the area, his soldier instincts kicking in. The cavern was too large, too open. If something was watching them, they were exposed. "Move," Ethan whispered. "Stay low." They crouched and followed the stream, moving toward the glowing moss. As they neared the cavern wall, a shadow moved in the distance. Ethan raised his rifle. His heart pounded. Then, a soft clicking sound. Salarin's eyes widened. "It is one of my people." Ethan turned sharply. Another alien. A tall, slender figure stepped from the shadows. Their skin was pale blue, their silver eyes glowing faintly. Unlike Salarin, this one wore dark, battle-scarred armor. They spoke in a language Ethan didn't understand, but Salarin did. "Takari," she whispered, barely believing it. The warrior's gaze flickered between her and Ethan. Then, in a low, measured voice, he spoke in broken English. "You are the human." Ethan kept his rifle steady. "Who's asking?" The alien warrior narrowed his eyes. "I am Kizan. I search for Salarin." Ethan glanced at Salarin. She looked both relieved and nervous. Kizan stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "You are the one who hurt her." Ethan's jaw tightened. So this warrior knew what had happened. Salarin raised a hand. "He helped me," she said firmly. Kizan hesitated, then looked at Ethan again. "Then prove it. The Dravok will return. Can you fight?" Ethan smirked. "Try me." Ethan kept his rifle aimed at Kizan, but the alien warrior showed no fear. His silver eyes remained locked onto the human, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick. Salarin took a shaky breath. "Enough. We don't have time for this." Kizan's gaze softened as he looked at her injury. "You are wounded." "I will survive," she said, though her voice was weak. "But we must leave. The Dravok will not stop hunting us." Ethan lowered his rifle slightly. "You seem to know this place." Kizan nodded. "There is an old tunnel nearby. It leads to the surface, but it is dangerous." Ethan smirked. "Dangerous? That's nothing new." Kizan studied him for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and motioned for them to follow. The journey begins. The cavern stretched on for miles. Massive stalactites hung from the ceiling, and the glowing moss painted everything in a soft blue light. The sound of flowing water echoed through the space. Kizan led the way, moving with silent precision. Ethan noted how easily the alien navigated the rough terrain. Even in armor, he moved like a shadow. Salarin, however, struggled. Her injury slowed her down, and her breathing grew heavier with every step. Ethan moved beside her. "Lean on me if you need to," he said quietly. She hesitated but then accepted his help. Her body was lighter than he expected, her frame more delicate. Kizan glanced back at them. "We must move faster." "I'd like to see you move faster with a bullet wound," Ethan muttered under his breath. Kizan ignored him. "We are near the tunnel, but something lurks ahead." Ethan's instincts sharpened. "What do you mean?" Kizan pointed toward the darkness ahead. The cavern narrowed into a passage, but the air felt wrong. Salarin's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. "Something is watching us. The guardian of the tunnel." A low growl rumbled from the shadows. It was deep, unnatural, something ancient. Ethan lifted his rifle. "What now?" Kizan's voice was grim. "The tunnel is guarded. A beast older than the Dravok lies here." Ethan cursed. "And you didn't think to mention that sooner." Kizan slowly unsheathed a long curved blade from his back. "We either fight, or we turn back and let the Dravok find us." A massive shape slithered forward. The dim blue light revealed dark scales, sharp claws, and glowing red eyes. Salarin's breath hitched. The Vrak. The beast, a monstrous, serpent-like creature, uncoiled itself from the shadows. Its massive head loomed over them, its fangs dripping with venom. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Great, just what I needed." The Vrak let out a deafening screech and lunged. Ethan fired. His bullet struck the thick scales, but barely slowed the beast down. Kizan dashed forward, his blade flashing. He moved with inhuman speed, slicing at the creature's side. The Vrak hissed in pain but swung its massive tail, sending Kizan flying into the cavern wall. Ethan barely had time to react before the beast turned toward him. A desperate plan. "Ethan, move." "Sail," Rin shouted. He dove to the side as the Vrak's jaws snapped shut where he had just been standing. Kizan groaned from where he had landed, struggling to get up. Ethan clenched his jaw. They couldn't win in a straight fight. Then he noticed something. The cavern ceiling. Above them, stalactites hung like massive spears. Some were loose. Ethan's mind raced. A plan. "Salarin, can you make a loud noise?" She was confused but nodded. "Yes, but why?" "Just do it." She inhaled sharply, then let out a high-pitched, piercing scream. The Vrak reared back, disoriented. Ethan aimed his rifle upward and fired. The bullet struck the base of a large stalactite, and with a loud crack, it fell. The massive rock spike slammed into the Vrak's head. The creature let out one final, agonized screech before collapsing. Its body twitched, then fell still. Silence filled the cavern. Ethan exhaled. Well, that worked. Kizan stood, rubbing his bruised shoulder. He gave Ethan an appraising look. "Perhaps humans are not as weak as I thought." Ethan smirked. "You'll learn that lesson the hard way if you keep underestimating us." Selrin smiled weakly. "We should go before more come." Kizan nodded. "The tunnel is just ahead." Together, they stepped past the fallen beast and into the passage, closer to their escape. Ethan's pulse quickened. The jungle around him was thick, but now it felt even smaller, like unseen eyes were closing in from all directions. The alien woman, Selrin, as she later introduced herself, winced as she shifted, pressing a hand to her wounded side. Despite the pain, her golden eyes remained sharp and alert. Ethan crouched beside her, keeping his rifle ready. "Who is coming?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Selrin took a deep breath before answering. "The Dravolk." Ethan had never heard that name before, but from the tension in her voice, he could tell it wasn't good. "They saw your ship enter the sky," she continued. "They hunt anything that is not theirs. They take, they destroy, they leave nothing behind." Ethan's jaw tightened. Another hostile alien race. He had heard of such things before, but this was his first real encounter. "How many?" he asked. Selrin closed her eyes for a second. When she reopened them, her ears twitched. 5. No, 6. They are fast. Ethan didn't question how she knew. He had seen strange abilities among alien species before. If she could sense them somehow, it didn't matter how. "Can you move?" he asked. She hesitated but then nodded. "Not fast, but I will not slow you down." Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out a small vial. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "Drink this. It will dull the pain." Selrin studied the vial for a moment before taking a cautious sip. She swallowed, then shuddered slightly. "Strange taste," she muttered. "You'll live," Ethan said, standing up. "Now, we need to move." The jungle was dense, but Ethan's training had taught him how to navigate difficult terrain. He led the way, moving carefully between thick roots and hanging vines. Selrin followed, keeping close despite her injury. Every few steps, she would glance behind them, her ears flicking as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she stopped suddenly. "They're closer," she whispered. Ethan turned, gripping his rifle. A shadow shifted between the trees. For a moment, silence. Then, a sharp guttural growl. Something was watching them. Selrin's hand brushed against his arm. "We must go. Now." Ethan didn't argue. He moved faster, leading them toward a rocky incline where the jungle thinned out. If they could get to higher ground, they might have a chance. As they climbed, a sudden roar shattered the silence. The Dravolk had found them. Ethan turned just in time to see a dark shape burst through the trees. A towering figure, armored and powerful, with glowing red eyes and sharp claws. It let out a furious snarl and lunged. Ethan fired. The shot struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely slowed. Celerin moved fast despite her wound. She grabbed a vine and swung herself onto a rock ledge, then extended a hand toward him. "Come," she urged. Ethan fired again, hitting the Dravolk in the leg, then jumped just as another creature emerged from the trees. He grabbed Celerin's hand, and she pulled him up. More Dravolk were coming, their growls filling the air. "Keep moving," Ethan said, pulling her forward. They ran along the rocky path, the creatures climbing after them with terrifying speed. Then Celerin suddenly grabbed his arm. "This way," she said, leading him toward a narrow gap between two massive boulders. Ethan squeezed through after her. The space was tight, but after a few meters, it opened into a small cave. Celerin leaned against the rock, breathing heavily. "They will not fit through easily," she said. Ethan peered through the gap. The Dravolk were outside, snarling in frustration. But they weren't leaving. "They'll wait us out," he muttered. Celerin nodded grimly. "They do not give up." Ethan checked his rifle. Only a few shots left. Not enough to take them all down. He looked at Celerin. "We need another plan." She met his gaze, her expression determined. "Then we make one." Outside, the Dravolk growled, their glowing eyes watching. The hunt was far from over. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls covered in strange bioluminescent fungi that pulsed with a faint blue glow. Ethan kept his rifle ready, his body tense. He didn't trust Kizan, not yet. The alien warrior had helped them fight the Vrak, but that didn't mean he wouldn't turn on them when it suited him. Celerin limped beside him, her wound still slowing her down. She was strong, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Kizan led the way, moving like a shadow. "The exit is close," he muttered. Ethan narrowed his eyes. He had a bad feeling. Something about Kizan's tone felt off. They pressed forward, the tunnel twisting and turning like a serpent's path. The air grew colder, and the sound of distant whispers reached Ethan's ears. He wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else. Then Kizan stopped. He turned to face them, his silver eyes unreadable. "We have a problem." "The trap." Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle. "What kind of problem?" Kizan hesitated, then stepped aside. The tunnel ahead opened into a vast chamber. The ground was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and broken bones, and in the center stood a group of armored figures. Ethan's stomach twisted. Dravolk. There were at least 10 of them, their tall, armored bodies glowing under the strange light. They had been waiting. Ethan turned back to Kizan, his jaw clenched. "You led us into a trap." Celerin's breath caught. "Kizan, why?" The alien warrior's face was cold. "I had no choice." One of the Dravolk stepped forward. He was larger than the others, his armor decorated with strange symbols. His voice was deep and filled with authority. "You have done well, Kizan." Ethan felt rage boiling inside him. They had trusted him. Celerin's eyes darkened with pain, not just from her wound, but from betrayal. "You swore to help us." Kizan's expression flickered, but he remained silent. The Dravolk leader smirked. "The human and the exile. You have caused much trouble." Ethan's mind raced. There were too many to fight. His rifle was powerful, but against 10 warriors, he wouldn't stand a chance. Celerin's fingers twitched, but she was too weak to use her energy-based powers. Kizan stepped forward. "I held up my end of the deal. Now let them go." The Dravolk leader laughed. "Fool." Before Kizan could react, the leader's blade shot forward, piercing Kizan's side. The alien warrior gasped, stumbling back. Silver blood dripped onto the ground. Ethan's eyes widened. Even Kizan hadn't expected betrayal. The Dravolk leader sneered. "You should know, Kizan. There are no rewards for traitors." The fight for survival. Kizan fell to one knee, clutching his wound. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. A single shot straight into the leader's helmet. The energy round blasted through the armor, sending the Dravolk leader crashing to the ground. For a second, there was silence. Then chaos exploded. The other Dravolk warriors roared, weapons drawn. Ethan grabbed Celerin and pulled her behind cover. Kezan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. His betrayal had turned on him, but he wasn't going to die here. "I will cover you," he said, his voice strained. Ethan hesitated. He still didn't fully trust Kezan, but there was no time for doubt. Kezan grabbed a fallen Dravolk blade and charged forward, slicing through one of his former allies. The betrayal had made him angry, and it showed in every strike. Ethan fired another shot, hitting an enemy in the leg. The Dravolk were strong, but they weren't invincible. Celerin pressed a hand to her wound, struggling to focus. She closed her eyes, channeling what little energy she had left. The cavern trembled. The Dravolk hesitated, sensing something shifting. The ground beneath them cracked. Celerin opened her eyes, breathing heavily. "We have to run. Now." Ethan grabbed her hand and turned to Kezan. "Move." The wounded warrior hesitated only a second before following. The escape. The tunnel behind them began to collapse. Rocks fell, crushing Dravolk warriors as they scrambled to escape. Ethan, Celerin, and Kezan ran. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and pain. Light appeared in the distance, the exit. Ethan's heart pounded. They were almost there. A final Dravolk warrior lunged from the shadows, blade raised. Kezan reacted first. His blade struck fast, cutting down the enemy in a single motion. He breathed heavily, then staggered. His wound was bad. Ethan caught him before he fell. "Come on, don't quit now." They reached the exit. Fresh air hit their faces as they stumbled onto the surface. Behind them, the cavern collapsed completely, sealing the Dravolk inside. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of the wind filled the silence. Kezan finally looked at Ethan. "I did not expect them to betray me." Ethan scoffed. "Welcome to the real world." Celerin smiled weakly. "At least we are free." Kezan exhaled. For now. Ethan knew he was right. The fight wasn't over yet. But at least for this moment, they had won. The air was cold on the surface of the planet, the sky overcast with thick, gray clouds. Ethan, Celerin, and Kezan stood in the center of the barren wasteland, surrounded by jagged rocks and the remnants of a battle that had only just begun. They had escaped the Dravolk, but they were far from safe. Kezan's wound was still bleeding, and although he tried to hide it, his movements were slower, more labored. Celerin, though exhausted, was focused, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They needed to keep moving, but their options were limited. "We can't stay here," Celerin said, her voice firm but weak. "The Dravolk will regroup and come after us." Kezan nodded, wincing with each movement. "I know. We need to reach the escape pod, but—" He trailed off, looking at the landscape, the vast distance that lay ahead. "It's too far. We won't make it in time." Ethan's heart sank. The pod was their only way off this planet, their only hope for survival. But the Dravolk were ruthless. They wouldn't let them escape easily. "We have to try," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "We can't give up now. We've come this far." Celerin turned to him, her face full of both pain and determination. "You're right. We won't give up." Kezan straightened himself, though he could barely stand. The betrayal by his own people still stung, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. "I'll cover you," he said, gritting his teeth. "You head to the pod. I'll slow them down." Ethan glanced at him, skeptical. Kezan's wound was serious. He wouldn't be able to hold off the Dravolk for long, but he knew there was no time to argue. "Just stay alive, Kezan," Ethan said, taking Celerin's hand and leading her away. The two of them started moving quickly, weaving through the rocks and debris. Behind them, Kezan turned and staggered toward a higher vantage point, where he could keep watch and provide cover for their escape. The first shots rang out before they had gone far. Dravolk soldiers had already spotted them, and they were closing in fast. Ethan ducked behind a large rock formation as a blast of energy whizzed past him, narrowly missing. He turned to Selrin. "We're not going to make it unless we move faster." She nodded, her face pale but focused. "We'll have to make a run for it." Ethan gritted his teeth. They could outrun the Dravolk for a short while, but the odds were against them. "On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. They ran. The sound of footsteps pounding the earth was deafening as they sprinted across the rocky terrain, every step bringing them closer to the escape pod, but also closer to their enemies. Behind them, Kezan fought with everything he had left, holding back the Dravolk soldiers with whatever weapons he could find. But there were too many of them, and his strength was quickly waning. Ethan could hear the crackle of energy weapons and Kezan's fierce roars as he battled the Dravolk. His heart ached for the warrior who had risked his life to help them, but there was no time to look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, the escape pod came into view. It was a small silver craft, half buried under a pile of rubble, but it was their ticket out. "We're almost there." "Sail," Ren shouted, urging Ethan forward. They reached the pod, and Ethan quickly began to work on the control panel. The Dravolk were closing in. They didn't have much time. Come on," Ethan muttered, his hands flying over the controls. The pod systems were damaged, but he'd fixed worse before. "Need a hand?" Sail Rin asked, her voice full of urgency. "I got it," Ethan said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Just keep an eye out. We're not out of the woods yet." The sound of footsteps grew louder. They were almost there. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the ground behind them. A blast of energy hit the pod, throwing Ethan and Sail Rin to the ground. "No," Ethan shouted, scrambling to his feet. He turned to see Kezan, bloodied and covered in smoke, standing tall, holding a large weapon he had clearly stolen from one of the Dravolk soldiers. "Kezan!" "No," Ethan yelled, but it was too late. Kezan fired the weapon at the approaching Dravolk, sending them scattering. But in doing so, he exposed himself. A hail of energy blasts struck him down. Ethan's heart broke as he saw the warrior fall, his body crumpling to the ground. "No," Sail Rin cried, running toward him. Ethan pulled her back. "We don't have time. We need to go." Sail Rin's eyes filled with sorrow, but she nodded. Together, they scrambled into the escape pod. The hatch closed, sealing them inside. Ethan punched the control panel, activating the pod's engines. The craft shot into the air, breaking through the atmosphere and leaving the doomed planet behind. As they soared into the vastness of space, Ethan looked out the window, the stars stretching out before them. He thought of Kezan, the sacrifice he made, the warrior who had given everything for them. "I will never forget him," Sail Rin whispered beside him. Ethan nodded. "Neither will I." The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself a moment of peace. They had survived, and they had Kezan's sacrifice to honor. And no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. As the escape pod drifted through space, the stars twinkling in the distance, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Humanity had survived because of their strength, and because of the allies they had made along the way. And that was something no enemy could take away.